Mr. Meadow, how are you, sir?
I am doing very well. Looking forward to hopefully inching closer to the start of training camp. I think it's positive that it seems as if both sides are finding some common ground on many different issues, so that's a plus.
Yeah, and you said this with Paul yesterday, that this is kind of going the opposite way of Major League Baseball, where it just seemed like the two sides pointing fingers at each other, saying, I'm not negotiating anymore, yelling and screaming. Look, everything's a negotiation. You're trying to figure out what's best for the league, best for the players, and safest for everybody. And it seems like both sides are having a real good faith effort to get this done. And there's still a lot of work to do, especially on the financial side of things. But the fact that they seem to have, at least according to reports, agreements on some of the testing, some of the safety protocols, the number of preseason games seems to be close, if not decided to. Nothing of this is official, of course. It's just according to reports, everybody. That the guys are going to show up. But the funny thing about it, Lance, even though the report date is the 28th, the protocol in order to get these guys starting to work is basically 5 days later, right?
Yeah.
So you have to have one negative test, 72 hours, another negative test, get the results the next day, then you show up to work. So it's basically you show up, you get tested, then you have to wait 5 days in order to be cleared, and then you actually get to start doing stuff. So we're looking at like August 2nd-ish for like the first time we're going to see these guys. And then we still don't know how long of a ramp-up it's going to be in terms of conditioning. That's something that's still in the negotiation as well. So there's a chance we're not going to even see these guys on the field doing football things without pads until the middle to the second half of August.
Yeah, I think that's a very good synopsis of the situation. And then to take it a step further, John, if they don't get on the field until mid-August with maybe shells on, let's say, then they're not going to get into padded live practices until probably the final 2 weeks right before the season starts. Now, everybody's in the same boat. So to me, it's not as if somebody has a significant advantage because they're all going to follow the same timeline based on the union regulations. But when you talk about 2 weeks of padded practices leading up to week one, no preseason games, once again, that's going to be quite the test and quite the challenge, I think, for all teams, specifically the teams in the Giants' case that are implementing new schemes, have a lot of new faces. I think that probably is the most fascinating aspect to monitor during training camp because the one thing that the players have argued, and it looks like this is going to be approved, as you noted, everything's all based on reports at this point, nothing's official. They want the bulk of, I would say, the first 3 to 4 weeks be strictly strength and conditioning. John, we're talking about 21 days potentially of strength and conditioning. And the reason behind that is if you go back to 2011, when pretty much training camp started immediately once they hammered out a new CBA. So it was, I want to say, maybe a few days into August. And then all of a sudden, injuries started piling up. And injuries also started piling up in the early stages of the season. So that's why the players are arguing, you can't bring us back and expect us to just put the pads on and everything's going to be business as usual. They want to make up, it seems, John, for what they missed out in OTAs, which I don't want to say is not useful, but it's more of going through the motions, making sure everybody is on the same level from a conditioning standpoint. Then when we pass that bar, now we feel comfortable putting the helmets and the pads on and so forth.
Yeah, and look, I get it. If this avoids major injuries and you avoid losing some of the best players in the game for an extended period of time, I think it's worth it. So that's why they're going through this negotiation period right now, right? To figure out how do you get the best product on the field when the season starts? Because really that's what this is all about, right? You want to make sure you get the best product on the field when the season starts. So how do you get there? And I think there are really good questions about how you get there. And there are no, and I think the one thing that everyone's missing in this pandemic, Lance, everyone tries to be, it's all one way or all the other way. It's always a give and take. There's always a cost benefit. You know what I mean? If you do one thing one way, then maybe you get a little less of B, but you get more of A, or you do less A, you get more of B. So this is just a balance that everyone is trying to strike here and strike the right balance. The other piece of news, I know you and Paul mentioned this yesterday. I don't want to spend a ton of time on this because you guys did a lot of this yesterday, but they look like they're now, again, this isn't just according to reports, instead of having 90 guys to start camp, you're just going to have 80. Now, I do think if you're going to have fewer padded practices, that makes sense because you want to get a larger look at the guys that have a real chance of making the teams. But usually those first 10 cuts, Lance, there are exceptions. Like Chase Blackburn was like the last guy on the training camp roster, right? He made the team. It worked. But for the most part, those last 10 guys, those last 15, sometimes even 20, you kind of know they're not going to make it. So I think if you pare it down a little bit here, you can get a better look at the guys you want to evaluate to know who makes the final roster and then who makes that extended practice squad.
Well, because when you do the math, if there are 16 players on the practice squad this year, John, which most people are anticipating, which I love that move. I think that makes a lot of sense. You want to have a little bit more flexibility. So 53 players plus the 16, you're talking about 69 guys that essentially you're hoping to have within your facility over the course of the season. So if you bring in 80, that essentially means there's 11 guys more that you're going to have to cut. And then in an ideal world, hopefully, given the fact that there's no preseason games, and I brought this up yesterday, I'll emphasize it again, less film out for the undrafted guys, late-round picks. Maybe they pass through waivers, and this way you maintain continuity. So I think that when you do the math, that's not bad, because now 11 guys maybe are fighting for roster spots as opposed to you bring in 90. Now we're talking about 21 guys. As you noted, John, very unlikely you're going to get a legitimate amount of reps for those 21 guys. It's much more manageable to work in the other 11. So I think from a mathematical standpoint, from a logistical standpoint, it makes sense. It's unfortunate. You want to see these guys who have been through all these Zoom meetings have an opportunity to actually translate all of their work through the computer screen onto the field. But I think based on the fact that you need to spread these guys out within the facility or the stadium, of course, if teams choose to use that, it's just not conducive right now to have 90 guys on top of one another.
Yeah, I agree. Number two, and you mentioned the waivers, I agree. I think there'll be much less waiver activity when you get to that cut day, the weekend of Labor Day weekend, which is when they always do the cut down. Because to your point, there aren't preseason games where teams get wowed. So the amount of pro personnel scouting these teams are going to be able to do during August is going to be minimal compared to what we've normally seen. Now, they can go off of their reports from the draft when the guys were, if they're an undrafted free agent, for example. So they'll go off those reports to decide who they want to take. But it's going to be hard, to your point, for teams to really pick out younger guys from other teams that they want to claim because there's no game film from the preseason. On the other hand, I think, Lance, this is going to be a heavy trade month because I think since teams are not going to be able to claim some of those young guys off waivers, and I think fewer veterans will hit the waiver wire because a lot of these young guys, it's harder for them to get ready, right, for the season because there's so little time in the offseason for them to get ready. So I think more veterans are going to make teams just because of their experience and you can trust them a little bit more. So I think you're going to have a situation where you could see a large amount of trades here where if one team has an extra veteran at, say, defensive line, another team has an extra veteran at wide receiver, and they have two needs there, well, maybe you swap those two players, right, heading into the trade deadline because you have pro personnel tape of those guys from playing in the NFL when you don't have it for the young guys. So I could see teams being very aggressive in the trade market in August as they get closer to that waiver deadline, moving veterans from team to team to fill some needs that certain teams might have.
Yeah, I think that makes very much sense. And I also could see perhaps some veterans right now on the market getting signed by teams, especially if they're looking for voids and maybe they don't want to give up an asset in a trade. But it's funny because listening to your breakdown, it reminds me of two recent transactions for the Giants. Your veteran point is probably well documented based on what the Giants did a few years back when they shipped Brett Jones to the Vikings, right as the final 53-man rosters were being finalized because they had some depth at the center position. The Vikings needed help. Okay, so the Giants didn't want him to pass through waivers and allow him to sign with another team and get nothing in return. They made a trade. And then last year, the Giants wound up signing Caden Smith, who we've been talking a great deal about this offseason after the Niners parted ways with him. And the Giants had mentioned if Caden Smith was still on the board, they in all likelihood would have drafted him. So there's an example of a player you were very much interested in him when you were scouting for the draft. He wasn't no longer on the board, so therefore you kept monitoring him. He became available. You decided to claim him. I could see a lot of that happening without preseason games, and then I could see a lot of the Brett Jones. Okay, we've got three guards we really like, John. We don't want to give away one of them. Okay, you have a wide receiver. We could use depth there. Why don't we trade the backup guard for the backup wide receiver? And that, I think, is then a win-win situation for both teams because then you're each addressing your need without having to worry about rolling the dice into the land of the unknown with a younger guy that may not have nearly as much experience in the NFL.
Especially for the Giants, and again, maybe the Dolphins end up having an excess defensive player they don't need, and he knows Patrick Graham's system already,
Yeah,
right? That
good
guy
point.
becomes even more valuable. Or for Dallas, maybe they have an offensive player that knows Garrett's system. And
Like a Cooper Rush, who was waived and then signed with the Giants.
Exactly. Or maybe there's a receiver deeper on the Cowboys depth chart or something like that Garrett really likes, and the Cowboys are going to cut him, but maybe they want to get something for him, and the Cowboys need like an extra young defensive back or something like that. You know what I mean? And they could work something like that out, which I think will be interesting. The other thing that I find fascinating is how, look, and we see this anyway, Lance, at the start of regular seasons, where the tackling to start a lot of these years can sometimes be a little bit not ideal.
That's one way to put it.
And now you get to this year when you're going to have no preseason games. So how are these guys going to get ready to tackle? And I did get one question in here from one of our listeners. I want to make sure I give the name properly here. And his question was basically, do you think you're going to have quote unquote live practices in order to get guys used to tackling? This is from at New York Ben 1963. So full tackling people to the ground in pads during practice. And, that's the only way you get better at it. But, I think you're a good person to talk to, because the Ivy League, Lance, a lot of these teams don't do any contact in practice, right? That's how they work, though. I think Dartmouth hasn't had contact in practice for a couple of years. So they use other things. They use like those remote control dummies, the rolling donut pads, and those sorts of things to practice tackling. The Seahawks, they use that rugby style tackling that they can work on without pads, and they do that in the spring. So those are the type of things that I think you can start to work on without pads if you want to try to get tackling done. But I do think it's going to be incumbent upon coaches to be creative here to try to get guys ready to play in full contact game situations when you're not going to have that in the summer. Because, look, Lance, maybe I'm wrong. And maybe Joe Judge will do something different because he's a different type of guy and he's smarter than me. But I've never seen live tackling in a practice. I've been going to practice since 2007. I haven't seen live tackling in practice. I've seen some penning, some thumping, some bopping. I've never seen live tackling. So I'd be surprised if we saw it this summer, but who knows? Maybe Joe Judge will do it. They're going to have to be creative to get these guys ready to tackle when the games start.
Yeah, especially since, once again, we haven't had OTAs. And in OTAs, while there's no contact, you can at least build up getting in sync with your defense and also just going through the mental reps and going through the motions without physically tackling somebody. So to bring in the Ivy League example, in the spring they're doing that so that by the time they get to summer workouts, you have that platform, that foundation that's been built to then stockpile on top of it. You don't have any platform. You don't have any foundation to build on that. You're pretty much working from scrap in terms of what you have to build here. I would agree with you. I don't think they're going to have many live tackling to the ground. I think there will be thumping. I think there will be as much physicality that they can encompass into a practice as humanly possible, because you're not going to want to just throw them to the wolves in week one and say, hey, guys, start taking guys to the ground. You have to at least slowly bulk them up to that. So, they're going to have to be creative. I also think that the individual drills with positional groups, John, is going to be important. I know we talk about that each and every offseason, but I would say that when the defensive lineman coach takes all of his defensive ends and linemen, what he does with them in that 20-minute session, I think is going to be extremely critical. The linebacking coach, the secondary, whether it's ball security, whether it's opportunistic play drills, you name it, because, that time alone in your positional group is when you're going to get through the mental reps that you probably would have done in OTAs. So there's going to be a lot of doubling up. But the bottom line is it's all about reps. It's all about doing it consistently for a 2-week stretch. So I think if I'm Joe Judge, I want to maximize the 2 weeks when they put the pads on. And I don't want to, do this one day and then don't bring it back until maybe 3 days later. I probably want to try to squeeze in as much as I can into one day so that the players get the feel of, hey, this is what it's going to be like on game day, and this is also what it's going to be like during the course of the week. We need to cram. It's basically like studying for a test, and instead of having the 3 weeks to build up to the test, now you only have about half the time. You got to maximize that time. That's going to be key, I think, for Joe Judge.
Yeah, I agree. I think it'll be interesting. One other thing I want to touch on, Lance, and Albert Breer put this out yesterday. This is still under negotiation, which is important to note, but the rough post-testing timeline, and we mentioned that, you're probably not going to get on the field till August 2nd, August 3rd. once you get through all the physicals and the testing and all that stuff. And this is what the timeline is going to look like. From August 3rd to August 14th will be the acclimation period, strength and conditioning. So that's about 11 days. August 15th, you get to some practices ramping up. Shells, helmets, no pads yet. And then late August, early September, you get some padded practices prior to week 1. The funny thing here, Lance, is that I feel like, thinking back now, they kind of relax on the padded practices a little bit when you get towards the end of the preseason normally, because you have that Thursday game in there, right? And you don't usually get padded practices at all between that third and fourth preseason games, because there's only like 3 or 4 days in between.
Quick turnaround.
Yeah, correct. So you're probably going to have padded practices much later here in the timeline than you usually would, simply because you're not going to have any preseason games. So it'll be another little bit of a change here as the NFL tries to work forward through this.
Yeah, I think that's an important point to note, and that's something that I don't think a lot of people are talking about. It's not ideal that there's no preseason games. We certainly have had those conversations over the last few days, but the benefit is all that travel time, all that recovery time, John, as you just pointed to, that you normally have to account for before and after games. So we're looking at a 3-day stretch at least, right? Because the day of travel before the game, and then you don't throw the guys back on the field. The next day, you give them recovery time. You're going to have those 3 days back that you would normally have to sacrifice. But to me, it sort of balances out, because as we're talking about, if there's going to be an 11-day period of strength and conditioning and then another 5 to 6 days, 10 days or so where you're not even putting the pads on, as I mentioned, you're looking at about 21 days, 3 weeks before you even get to padded practices. So while you're getting the days back that you would have sacrificed in normal preseason scheduling, it's not as if you're gaining an awful lot back, because you're still making up for the missed time in strength and scheduling. So I would say when it's all said and done, it's probably going to balance out to just as many practices as they typically have during the course of a preseason.
Yeah, I mean, you'll have less padded probably, but you're still going to have days off, Lance. And there are rules. You have to have days off after X number of days. But yeah, to your point, I agree. I think that's fair. But there will be less, full contact stuff. And look, it'll be interesting. They'll figure it out.